The Coming Race. Chapter 1. I am a native of the United States of America. My ancestors migrated from England in the reign of Charles II, and my grandfather was not undistinguished in the War of Independence. My family, therefore, enjoyed a somewhat high social position in right of birth, and being also opulent, they were considered disqualified for the public service. My father once ran for Congress, but was signally defeated by his tailor. After that event, he interfered little in politics and lived much in his library. I was the eldest of three sons and sent at the age of 16 to the old country, partly to complete my literary education, partly to commence my commercial training in a mercantile firm at Liverpool. My father died shortly after I was 21, and being left well off and having a taste for travel and adventure, I resigned for a time all pursuit of the almighty dollar and became a desultory wanderer over the face of the earth. In the year 18, happening to be in location omitted, I was invited by a professional engineer with whom I had made acquaintance to visit the recesses of the mine upon which he was employed. The reader will understand, ere he closes this narrative, my reason for concealing all clue to the district of which I write, and will perhaps thank me for refraining from any description that may tend to its discovery. Let me say, then, as briefly as possible, that I accompanied the engineer into the interior of the mine and became so strangely fascinated by its gloomy wonders and so interested in my friend's explorations that I prolonged my stay in the neighborhood and descended daily, for some weeks, into the vaults and galleries hollowed by nature and art beneath the surface of the earth. The engineer was persuaded that far richer deposits of mineral wealth than had yet been detected would be found in a new shaft that had been commenced under his operations. In piercing this shaft, we came one day upon a chasm jagged and seemingly charred at the sides, as if burst asunder at some distant period by volcanic fires. Down this chasm, my friend caused himself to be lowered in a cage, having first tested the atmosphere by the safety lamp. He remained nearly an hour in the abyss. When he returned, he was very pale and with an anxious, thoughtful expression of face, very different from its ordinary character, which was open, cheerful, and fearless. He said briefly that the descent appeared to him unsafe and leading to no result, and suspending further operations in the shaft, we returned to the more familiar parts of the mine. All the rest of that day, the engineer seemed preoccupied by some absorbing thought. He was unusually taciturn, and there was a scared, bewildered look in his eyes, as that of a man who has seen a ghost. At night, as we two were sitting alone in the lodging we shared together near the mouth of the mine, I said to my friend, "Tell me frankly what you saw in that chasm. I am sure it was something strange and terrible. Whatever it be, it has left your mind in a state of doubt. In such a case, two heads are better than one. Confide in me." The engineer long endeavored to evade my inquiries, but as, while he spoke, he helped himself unconsciously out of the brandy flask to a degree to which he was wholly unaccustomed, for he was a very temperate man, his reserve gradually melted away. He who would keep himself to himself should imitate the dumb animals and drink water. At last he said, "I will tell you all. When the cage stopped, I found myself on a ridge of rock, and below me, the chasm, taking a slanting direction, shot down to a considerable depth, the darkness of which my lamp could not have penetrated, but through it, to my infinite surprise, streamed upward a steady brilliant light. Could it be any volcanic fire? In that case, surely I should have felt the heat. Still, if on this there was doubt, it was of the utmost importance to our common safety to clear it up. I examined the sides of the descent and found that I could venture to trust myself to the irregular projections or ledges, at least for some way. I left the cage and clambered down. As I drew near and nearer to the light, the chasm became wider, and at last I saw, to my unspeakable amaze, a broad level road at the bottom of the abyss, illumined as far as the eye could reach by what seemed artificial gas lamps placed at regular intervals, as in the thoroughfare of a great city. and I heard confusedly at a distance a hum as of human voices. I know, of course, that no rival miners are at work in this district. Whose could be those voices? What human hands could have leveled that road and marshaled those lamps? The superstitious belief, common to miners, that gnomes or fiends dwell within the bowels of the earth, began to seize me. I shuddered at the thought of descending further and braving the inhabitants of this nether valley. Nor indeed could I have done so without ropes, as from the spot I had reached to the bottom of the chasm. The sides of the rock sank down abrupt, smooth, and sheer. I retraced my steps with some difficulty. Now I have told you all. You will descend again? I ought, yet I feel as if I durst not. A trusty companion halves the journey and doubles the courage. I will go with you. We will provide ourselves with ropes of suitable length and strength, and pardon me, you must not drink more tonight. Our hands and feet must be steady and firm tomorrow. Chapter 2. With the morning, my friend's nerves were rebraced, and he was not less excited by curiosity than myself. Perhaps more, for he evidently believed in his own story, and I felt considerable doubt of it. Not that he would have willfully told an untruth, but that I thought he must have been under one of those hallucinations which seize on our fancy or our nerves in solitary, unaccustomed places, and in which we give shape to the formless and sound to the dumb. We selected 6 veteran miners to watch our descent, and as the cage held only one at a time, the engineer descended first, and when he had gained the ledge at which he had before halted, the cage re-arose for me. I soon gained his side. We had provided ourselves with a strong coil of rope. The light struck on my sight as it had done the day before on my friend's. The hollow through which it came sloped diagonally. It seemed to me a diffused atmospheric light, not like that from fire, but soft and silvery, as from a northern star. Quitting the cage, we descended, one after the other, easily enough, owing to the juts in the side, till we reached the place at which my friend had previously halted, and which was a projection just spacious enough to allow us to stand abreast. From this spot, the chasm widened rapidly like the lower end of a vast funnel, and I saw distinctly the valley, the road, the lamps which my companion had described. He had exaggerated nothing. I heard the sounds he had heard, a mingled indescribable hum as of voices and a dull tramp as of feet. Straining my eye farther down, I clearly beheld at a distance the outline of some large building. It could not be mere natural rock. It was too symmetrical, with huge, heavy Egyptian-like columns, and the whole lighted as from within. I had about me a small pocket telescope, and by the aid of this, I could distinguish, near the building I mentioned, 2 forms which seemed human, though I could not be sure. At least they were living, for they moved, and both vanished within the building. We now proceeded to attach the end of the rope we had brought with us to the ledge on which we stood, by the aid of clamps and grappling hooks, with which, as well as with necessary tools, we were provided. We were almost silent in our work. We toiled like men afraid to speak to each other. One end of the rope being thus apparently made firm to the ledge, the other, to which we fastened a fragment of the rock, rested on the ground below, a distance of some 50 feet. I was a younger and a more active man than my companion, and having served on board ship in my boyhood, this mode of transit was more familiar to me than to him. In a whisper, I claimed the precedence, so that when I gained the ground, I might serve to hold the rope more steady for his descent. I got safely to the ground beneath, and the engineer now began to lower himself. But he had scarcely accomplished 10 feet of the descent when the fastenings, which we had fancied so secure, gave way, or rather the rock itself proved treacherous and crumbled beneath the strain, and the unhappy man was precipitated to the bottom, falling just at my feet and bringing down with his fall splinters of the rock, one of which, fortunately but a small one, struck, and for the time stunned me. When I recovered my senses, I saw my companion an inanimate mass beside me, life utterly extinct. While I was bending over his corpse in grief and horror, I heard close at hand a strange sound between a snort and a hiss, and turning instinctively to the quarter from which it came, I saw emerging from a dark fissure in the rock a vast and terrible head, with open jaws and dull, ghastly, hungry eyes, the head of a monstrous reptile resembling that of the crocodile or alligator, but infinitely larger than the largest creature of that kind I had ever beheld in my travels. I started to my feet and fled down the valley at my utmost speed. I stopped at last, ashamed of my panic and my flight, and returned to the spot on which I had left the body of my friend. It was gone. Doubtless the monster had already drawn it into its den and devoured it. The rope and the grappling hooks still lay where they had fallen, but they afforded me no chance of return. It was impossible to reattach them to the rock above, and the sides of the rock were too sheer and smooth for human steps to clamber. I was alone in this strange world, amidst the bowels of the earth. Chapter 3. Slowly and cautiously, I went my solitary way down the lamplit road and towards the large building I have described. The road itself seemed like a great alpine pass, skirting rocky mountains of which the one through whose chasms I had descended formed a link. Deep below to the left lay a vast valley, which presented to my astonished eye the unmistakable evidences of art and culture. They were fields covered with a strange vegetation, similar to none I have seen above the earth. The color of it not green, but rather of a dull leaden hue or of a golden red. There were lakes and rivulets which seemed to have been curved into artificial banks, some of pure water, others that shone like pools of naphtha. At my right hand, ravines and defiles opened amidst the rocks, with passes between, evidently constructed by art, and bordered by trees resembling, for the most part, gigantic ferns, with exquisite varieties of feathery foliage, and stems like those of the palm tree. Others were more like the cane plant, but taller, bearing large clusters of flowers. Others, again, had the form of enormous fungi, with short, thick stems supporting a wide dome-like roof, from which either rose or drooped long, slender branches. The whole scene behind, before, and beside me, far as the eye could reach, was brilliant with innumerable lamps. The world without a sun was bright and warm as an Italian landscape at noon, but the air less oppressive, the heat softer. Nor was the scene before me void of signs of habitation. I could distinguish at a distance, whether on the banks of lake or rivulet, or halfway upon eminences, embedded amidst the vegetation, buildings that must surely be the homes of men. I could even discover, though far off, forms that appeared to me human moving amidst the landscape. As I paused to gaze, I saw to the right, gliding quickly through the air, what appeared a small boat, impelled by sails shaped like wings. It soon passed out of sight, descending amidst the shades of a forest. Right above me there was no sky, but only a cavernous roof. This roof grew higher and higher at the distance of the landscapes beyond, till it became imperceptible, as an atmosphere of haze formed itself beneath. Continuing my walk, I started from a bush that resembled a great tangle of seaweeds, interspersed with fern-like shrubs and plants of large leafage, shaped like that of the aloe, or prickly pear, a curious animal about the size and shape of a deer. But as, after bounding away a few paces, it turned round and gazed at me inquisitively, I perceived that it was not like any species of deer now extant above the earth, but it brought instantly to my recollection a plaster cast I had seen in some museum of a variety of the elk stag, said to have existed before the deluge. The creature seemed tame enough, and after inspecting me a moment or two, began to graze on the singular herbage around, undismayed and careless. Chapter 4. I now came in full sight of the building. Yes, it had been made by hands and hollowed partly out of a great rock. I should have supposed it at the first glance to have been of the earliest form of Egyptian architecture. It was fronted by huge columns, tapering upward from massive plinths, and with capitals that, as I came nearer, I perceived to be more ornamental and more fantastically graceful than Egyptian architecture allows. As the Corinthian capital mimics the leaf of the acanthus, so the capitals of these columns imitated the foliage of the vegetation neighboring them, some aloe-like, some fern-like. And now there came out of this building a form human. Was it human? It stood on the broad way and looked around, beheld me, and approached. It came within a few yards of me, and at the sight and presence of it, an indescribable awe and tremor seized me, rooting my feet to the ground. It reminded me of symbolical images of genius or demon that are seen on Etruscan vases or limned on the walls of Eastern sepulchres, images that borrow the outlines of man and are yet of another race. It was tall, not gigantic, but tall as the tallest men below the height of giants. Its chief covering seemed to me to be composed of large wings folded over its breast and reaching to its knees. The rest of its attire was composed of an under tunic and leggings of some thin fibrous material. It wore on its head a kind of tiara that shone with jewels, and carried in its right hand a slender staff of bright metal like polished steel. But the face, it was that which inspired my awe and my terror. It was the face of man, but yet of a type of man distinct from our known extant races. The nearest approach to it in outline and expression is the face of the sculptured Sphinx, so regular in its calm, intellectual, mysterious beauty. Its color was peculiar, more like that of the red man than any other variety of our species, and yet different from it, a richer and a softer hue, with large black eyes, deep and brilliant, and brows arched as a semicircle. The face was beardless, but a nameless something in the aspect, tranquil though the expression, and beauteous though the features, roused that instinct of danger which the sight of a tiger or serpent arouses. I felt that this man-like image was endowed with forces inimical to man. As it drew near, a cold shudder came over me. I fell on my knees and covered my face with my hands. Chapter 5. A voice accosted me, a very quiet and very musical key of voice in a language of which I could not understand a word, but it served to dispel my fear. I uncovered my face and looked up. The stranger, I could scarcely bring myself to call him man, surveyed me with an eye that seemed to read to the very depths of my heart. He then placed his left hand on my forehead, and with the staff in his right gently touched my shoulder. The effect of this double contact was magical. In place of my former terror, there passed into me a sense of contentment, of joy, of confidence in myself and in the being before me. I rose and spoke in my own language. He listened to me with apparent attention, but with a slight surprise in his looks, and shook his head as if to signify that I was not understood. He then took me by the hand and led me in silence to the building. The entrance was open indeed, there was no door to it. We entered an immense hall, lighted by the same kind of luster as in the scene without, but diffusing a fragrant odor. The floor was in large tessellated blocks of precious metals and partly covered with a sort of mat-like carpeting. A strain of low music, above and around, undulated as if from invisible instruments, seeming to belong naturally to the place, just as the sound of murmuring waters belongs to a rocky landscape or the warble of birds to vernal groves. A figure, in a simpler garb than that of my guide, but of similar fashion, was standing motionless near the threshold. My guide touched it twice with his staff, and it put itself into a rapid and gliding movement, skimming noiselessly over the floor. Gazing on it, I then saw that it was no living form, but a mechanical automaton. It might be 2 minutes after it vanished through a doorless opening, half screened by curtains at the other end of the hall, when through the same opening advanced a boy of about 12 years old, with features closely resembling those of my guide, so that they seemed to me evidently son and father. On seeing me, the child uttered a cry and lifted a staff like that borne by my guide, as if in menace. At a word from the elder, he dropped it. The two then conversed for some moments, examining me while they spoke. The child touched my garments and stroked my face with evident curiosity, uttering a sound like a laugh, but with an hilarity more subdued than the mirth of our laughter. Presently the roof of the hall opened and a platform descended, seemingly constructed on the same principle as the lifts used in hotels and warehouses for mounting from one story to another. The stranger placed himself and the child on the platform and motioned to me to do the same, which I did. We ascended quickly and safely and alighted in the midst of a corridor with doorways on either side. Through one of these doorways, I was conducted into a chamber fitted up with an oriental splendor. The walls were tessellated with spars, metals, and uncut jewels. Cushions and divans abounded. Apertures as for windows, but unglazed, were made in the chamber, opening to the floor. And as I passed along, I observed that these openings led into spacious balconies and commanded views of the illumined landscape without. In cages suspended from the ceiling, there were birds of strange form in bright plumage, which at our entrance set up a chorus of song, modulated into tune as is that of our piping bullfinches. A delicious fragrance, from censers of gold elaborately sculptured, filled the air. Several automata, like the one I had seen, stood dumb and motionless by the walls. The stranger placed me beside him on a divan, and again spoke to me, and again I spoke, but without the least advance towards understanding each other. But now I began to feel the effects of the blow I had received from the splinters of the falling rock more acutely than I had done at first. There came over me a sense of sickly faintness, accompanied with acute, lancinating pains in the head and neck. I sank back on the seat and strove in vain to stifle a groan. On this, the child, who had hitherto seemed to eye me with distrust or dislike, knelt by my side to support me. Taking one of my hands in both his own, he approached his lips to my forehead, breathing on it softly. In a few moments my pain ceased. A drowsy, happy calm crept over me. I fell asleep. How long I remained in this state, I know not, but when I woke, I felt perfectly restored. My eyes opened upon a group of silent forms seated around me in the gravity and quietude of Orientals, all more or less like the first stranger. The same mantling wings, the same fashion of garment, the same sphinx-like faces, with the deep dark eyes and red man's color. Above all, the same type of race akin to man's, but infinitely stronger of form and grander of aspect, and inspiring the same unutterable feeling of dread. Yet each countenance was mild and tranquil, and even kindly in its expression. And strangely enough, it seemed to me that in this very calm and benignity consisted the secret of the dread which the countenances inspired. They seemed as void of the lines and shadows which care and sorrow, and passion and sin, leave upon the faces of men, as are the faces of sculptured gods, or as, in the eyes of Christian mourners, seem the peaceful brows of the dead. I felt a warm hand on my shoulder. It was the child's. In his eyes, there was a sort of lofty pity and tenderness, such as that with which we may gaze on some suffering bird or butterfly. I shrank from that touch, I shrank from that eye. I was vaguely impressed with a belief that, had he so pleased, that child could have killed me as easily as a man can kill a bird or a butterfly. The child seemed pained at my repugnance, quitted me, and placed himself beside one of the windows. The others continued to converse with each other in a low tone, and by their glances towards me, I could perceive that I was the object of their conversation. One in especial seemed to be urging some proposal affecting me on the being whom I had first met, and this last, by his gesture, seemed about to assent to it, when the child suddenly quitted his post by the window, placed himself between me and the other forms, as if in protection, and spoke quickly and eagerly. By some intuition or instinct, I felt that the child I had before so dreaded was pleading in my behalf. Ere he had ceased, another stranger entered the room. He appeared older than the rest, though not old. His countenance, less smoothly serene than theirs, though equally regular in its features, seemed to me to have more the touch of a humanity akin to my own. He listened quietly to the words addressed to him, first by my guide, next by two others of the group, and lastly by the child, then turned towards myself and addressed me, not by words, but by signs and gestures. These I fancied that I perfectly understood, and I was not mistaken. I comprehended that he inquired whence I came. I extended my arm and pointed towards the road which had led me from the chasm in the rock. Then an idea seized me. I drew forth my pocketbook and sketched on one of its blank leaves a rough design of the ledge of the rock, the rope, myself clinging to it, then of the cavernous rock below, the head of the reptile, the lifeless form of my friend. I gave this primitive kind of hieroglyph to my interrogator, who, after inspecting it gravely, handed it to his next neighbor, and it thus passed round the group. The being I had at first encountered then said a few words, and the child, who approached and looked at my drawing, nodded as if he comprehended its purport, and returning to the window, expanded the wings attached to his form, shook them once or twice, and then launched himself into space without. I started up in amaze and hastened to the window. The child was already in the air, buoyed on his wings, which he did not flap to and fro as a bird does, but which were elevated over his head and seemed to bear him steadily aloft without effort of his own. His flight seemed as swift as any eagle's, and I observed that it was towards the rock whence I had descended, of which the outline loomed visible in the brilliant atmosphere. In a very few minutes he returned, skimming through the opening from which he had gone, and dropping on the floor the rope and grappling hooks I had left at the descent from the chasm. Some words in a low tone passed between the beings present. One of the group touched an automaton, which started forward and glided from the room. Then the last comer, who had addressed me by gestures, rose, took me by the hand, and led me into the corridor. There the platform by which I had mounted awaited us. We placed ourselves on it and were lowered into the hall below. My new companion, still holding me by the hand, conducted me from the building into a street, so to speak, that stretched beyond it, with buildings on either side, separated from each other by gardens bright with rich-colored vegetation and strange flowers. Interspersed amidst these gardens, which were divided from each other by low walls, while walking slowly along the road, were many forms similar to those I had already seen. Some of the passers-by, on observing me, approached my guide, evidently by their tones, looks, and gestures addressing to him inquiries about myself. In a few moments, a crowd collected round us, examining me with great interest, as if I were some rare wild animal. Yet even in gratifying their curiosity, they preserved a grave and courteous demeanor, and after a few words from my guide, who seemed to me to deprecate obstruction in our road, they fell back with a stately inclination of head and resumed their own way with tranquil indifference. Midway in this thoroughfare, we stopped at a building that differed from those we had hitherto passed, inasmuch as it formed three sides of a vast court, at the angles of which were lofty pyramidal towers. In the open space between the sides was a circular fountain of colossal dimensions, and throwing up a dazzling spray of what seemed to me fire. We entered the building through an open doorway and came into an enormous hall, in which were several groups of children, all apparently employed in work as at some great factory. There was a huge engine in the wall which was in full play, with wheels and cylinders resembling our own steam engines, except that it was richly ornamented with precious stones and metals, and appeared to emanate a pale phosphorescent atmosphere of shifting light. Many of the children were at some mysterious work on this machinery. Others were seated before tables. I was not allowed to linger long enough to examine into the nature of their employment. Not one young voice was heard, not one young face turned to gaze on us. They were all still and indifferent as may be ghosts, through the midst of which pass unnoticed the forms of the living. Quitting this hall, my guide led me through a gallery richly painted in compartments, with a barbaric mixture of gold in the colors, like pictures by Lucas Cranach. The subjects described on these walls appeared to my glance as intended to illustrate events in the history of the race amidst which I was admitted. In all there were figures, most of them like the man-like creatures I had seen, but not all in the same fashion of garb, nor all with wings. There were also the effigies of various animals and birds wholly strange to me, with backgrounds depicting landscapes or buildings. So far as my imperfect knowledge of the pictorial art would allow me to form an opinion, these paintings seemed very accurate in design and very rich in coloring, showing a perfect knowledge of perspective, but their details not arranged according to the rules of composition acknowledged by our artists, wanting, as it were, a center, so that the effect was vague, scattered, confused, bewildering. They were like heterogeneous fragments of a dream of art. We now came into a room of moderate size, in which was assembled what I afterwards knew to be the family of my guide, seated at a table spread as for repast. The forms thus grouped were those of my guide's wife, his daughter, and two sons. I recognized at once the difference between the two sexes, though the two females were of taller stature and ampler proportions than the males, and their countenances, if still more symmetrical in outline and contour, were devoid of the softness and timidity of expression which give charm to the face of woman as seen on the earth above. The wife wore no wings, the daughter wore wings longer than those of the males. My guide uttered a few words, on which all the persons seated rose, and with that peculiar mildness of look and manner which I have before noticed, and which is, in truth, the common attribute of this formidable race, they saluted me according to their fashion, which consists in laying the right hand very gently on the head, and uttering a soft sibilant monosyllable C, equivalent to welcome. The mistress of the house then seated me beside her and heaped a golden platter before me from one of the dishes. While I ate, and though the viands were new to me, I marveled more at the delicacy than the strangeness of their flavor. My companions conversed quietly, and so far as I could detect, with polite avoidance of any direct reference to myself or any obtrusive scrutiny of my appearance. Yet I was the first creature of that variety of the human race to which I belonged that they had ever beheld, and was consequently regarded by them as a most curious and abnormal phenomenon. But all rudeness is unknown to this people, and the youngest child is taught to despise any vehement emotional demonstration. When the meal was ended, my guide again took me by the hand, and re-entering the gallery, touched a metallic plate inscribed with strange figures, and which I rightly conjectured to be of the nature of our telegraphs. A platform descended, but this time we mounted to a much greater height than in the former building, and found ourselves in a room of moderate dimensions, in which in its general character had much that might be familiar to the associations of a visitor from the upper world. There were shelves on the wall containing what appeared to be books, and indeed were so, mostly very small, like our diamond duodecimos, shaped in the fashion of our volumes, and bound in fine sheets of metal. There were several curious-looking pieces of mechanism scattered about, apparently models, such as might be seen in the study of any professional mechanician. 4 automata mechanical contrivances which, with these people, answer the ordinary purposes of domestic service stood phantom-like at each angle in the wall. In a recess was a low couch or bed with pillows. A window, with curtains of some fibrous material drawn aside, opened upon a large balcony. My host stepped out into the balcony. I followed him. We were on the uppermost story of one of the angular pyramids. The view beyond was of a wild and solemn beauty impossible to describe. The vast ranges of precipitous rock which formed the distant background, the intermediate valleys of mystic many-colored herbage, the flash of waters, many of them like streams of roseate flame, the serene luster diffused over all by myriads of lamps, combined to form a whole of which no words of mine can convey adequate description. So splendid was it, yet so somber, so lovely, yet so awful. But my attention was soon diverted from these nether landscapes. Suddenly there arose, as from the streets below, a burst of joyous music. Then a winged form soared into the space. Another, as in chase of the first, another and another, others after others, till the crowd grew thick and the number countless. But how describe the fantastic grace of these forms in their undulating movements? They appeared engaged in some sport or amusement, now forming into opposite squadrons, now scattering, now each group threading the other, soaring, descending, interweaving, severing, all in measured time to the music below, as if in the dance of the fabled Peri. I turned my gaze on my host in a feverish wonder. I ventured to place my hand on the large wings that lay folded on his breast, and in doing so a slight shock as of electricity passed through me. I recoiled in fear. My host smiled, and as if courteously to gratify my curiosity, slowly expanded his pinions. I observed that his garment beneath then became dilated as a bladder that fills with air. The arms seemed to slide into the wings, and in another moment he had launched himself into the luminous atmosphere and hovered there, still, and with outspread wings, as an eagle that basks in the sun. Then, rapidly as an eagle swoops, he rushed downwards into the midst of one of the groups, skimming through the midst, and as suddenly again soaring aloft. Thereon, three forms, in one of which I thought to recognize my host's daughter, detached themselves from the rest and followed him as a bird sportively follows a bird. My eyes, dazzled with the lights and bewildered by the throngs, ceased to distinguish the gyrations and evolutions of these winged playmates, till presently my host re-emerged from the crowd and alighted at my side. The strangeness of all I had seen began now to operate fast on my senses. My mind itself began to wander, though not inclined to be superstitious, nor hitherto believing that man could be brought into bodily communication with demons. I felt the terror and the wild excitement with which, in the Gothic ages, a traveler might have persuaded himself that he witnessed a sabbat of fiends and witches. I have a vague recollection of having attempted, with vehement gesticulation and forms of exorcism and loud incoherent words, to repel my courteous and indulgent host, of his mild endeavors to calm and soothe me, of his intelligent conjecture that my fright and bewilderment were occasioned by the difference of form and movement between us, which the wings that had excited my marveling curiosity had, in exercise, made still more strongly perceptible, of the gentle smile with which he had sought to dispel my alarm by dropping the wings to the ground and endeavoring to show me that they were but a mechanical contrivance. That sudden transformation did but increase my horror, and as extreme fright often shows itself by extreme daring, I sprang at his throat like a wild beast. On an instant I was felled to the ground as by an electric shock, and the last confused images floating before my sight ere I became wholly insensible were the form of my host kneeling beside me with one hand on my forehead, and the beautiful calm face of his daughter with large, deep, inscrutable eyes intently fixed upon my own. Chapter 6. I remained in this unconscious state, as I afterwards learned, for many days, even for some weeks, according to our computation of time. When I recovered, I was in a strange room. My host and all his family were gathered around me, and to my utter amazement, my host's daughter accosted me in my own language with but a slightly foreign accent. "How do you feel?" she asked. It was some moments before I could overcome my surprise enough to falter out, "You know my language? How? Who and what are you?" My host smiled and motioned to one of his sons, who then took from a table a number of thin metallic sheets on which were traced drawings of various figures, a house, a tree, a bird, a man, etc. In these designs, I recognized my own style of drawing. Under each figure was written the name of it in my language, and in my writing, and in another handwriting, a word strange to me beneath it, said the host. Thus we began, and my daughter Z, who belongs to the College of Sages, has been your instructress and ours too. Z then placed before me other metallic sheets, on which, in my writing, words first, and then sentences were inscribed. Under each word and each sentence were strange characters in another hand. Rallying my senses, I comprehended that thus a rudimentary dictionary had been created, had it been done while I was dreaming. "That is enough now," said Z, in a tone of command. "Repose and take food." Chapter 7. A room to myself was assigned to me in this vast edifice. It was prettily and fantastically arranged, but without any of the splendor of metalwork or gems displayed in the more public apartments. The walls were hung with a variegated matting made from the stalks and fibers of plants, and the floor carpeted with the same. The bed was without curtains, its supports of iron resting on balls of crystal, the coverings of a thin white substance resembling cotton. There were sundry shelves containing books. A curtain recess communicated with an aviary filled with singing birds, none of which I recognized as resembling those I have seen on Earth, except a beautiful species of dove, though this was distinguished from our doves by a tall crest of bluish plumes. All these birds had been trained to sing in artful tunes and greatly exceeded the skill of our piping bullfinches, which can rarely achieve more than two tunes and cannot, I believe, sing those in concert. One might have supposed oneself at an opera in listening to the voices in my aviary. There were duets, trios, quartets, and choruses, all arranged as in one piece of music. Did I want to silence the birds? I had but to draw a curtain over the aviary, and their song hushed as they found themselves left in the dark. Another opening formed a window, not glazed, but on touching a spring, a shutter ascended from the floor, formed of some substance less transparent than glass, but still sufficiently pellucid to allow a softened view of the scene without. To this window was attached a balcony, or rather a hanging garden, wherein grew many graceful plants and brilliant flowers. The apartment and its appurtenances had a character, if strange in detail, still familiar as a whole to modern notions of luxury, and would have excited admiration if found attached to the apartments of an English duchess or a fashionable French author. Before I arrived, this had been Z's chamber. She had hospitably assigned it to me. Some hours after the waking up described in my last chapter, I was lying alone on my couch, trying to fix my thoughts on conjecture as to the nature and genus of the people amongst whom I was thrown, when my host and his daughter Z entered the room. My host, still speaking my native language, inquired, with much politeness, whether it would be agreeable to me to converse or if I preferred solitude. I replied that I should feel much honored and obliged by the opportunity offered me to express my gratitude for the hospitality and civilities I had received in a country to which I was a stranger, and to learn enough of its customs and manners not to offend through ignorance. As I spoke, I had of course risen from my couch, but Z, much to my confusion, curtly ordered me to lie down again, and there was something in her voice and eye, gentle as both were, that compelled my obedience. She then seated herself unconcernedly at the foot of my bed, while her father took his place on a divan a few feet distant. "But what part of the world do you come from?" asked my host, "that we should appear so strange to you, and you to us? I have seen individual specimens of nearly all the races differing from our own, except the primeval savages who dwell in the most desolate and remote recesses of uncultivated nature, unacquainted with other light than that they obtain from volcanic fires, and contented to grope their way in the dark, as do many creeping, crawling, and even flying things. But certainly, you cannot be a member of those barbarous tribes, nor, on the other hand, do you seem to belong to any civilized people." I was somewhat nettled at this last observation, and replied that I had the honor to belong to one of the most civilized nations of the earth, and that, so far as light was concerned, while I admired the ingenuity and disregard of expense with which my host and his fellow citizens had contrived to illumine the regions unpenetrated by the rays of the sun, yet I could not conceive how any who had once beheld the orbs of heaven could compare to their luster the artificial lights invented by the necessities of man. But my host said he had seen specimens of most of the races differing from his own, save the wretched barbarians he had mentioned. Now, was it possible that he had never been on the surface of the earth, or could he only be referring to communities buried within its entrails? My host was for some moments silent. His countenance showed a degree of surprise which the people of that race very rarely manifest under any circumstances, however extraordinary. But Z was more intelligent and exclaimed, "So you see, my father, that there is truth in the old tradition. There always is truth in every tradition commonly believed in all times and by all tribes." "Z," said my host mildly, "you belong to the College of Sages and ought to be wiser than I am. But as chief of the Light-Preserving Council, it is my duty to take nothing for granted till it is proved to the evidence of my own senses." Then, turning to me, He asked me several questions about the surface of the earth and the heavenly bodies, upon which, though I answered him to the best of my knowledge, my answers seemed not to satisfy nor convince him. He shook his head quietly and, changing the subject rather abruptly, asked how I had come down from what he was pleased to call one world to the other. I answered that under the surface of the earth there were mines containing minerals or metals essential to our wants and our progress in all arts and industries, and I then briefly explained the manner in which, while exploring one of these mines, I and my ill-fated friend had obtained a glimpse of the regions into which we had descended, and how the descent had cost him his life, appealing to the rope and grappling hooks that the child had brought to the house in which I had been first received, as a witness of the truthfulness of my story. My host then proceeded to question me as to the habits and modes of life among the races on the upper earth, more especially among those considered to be the most advanced in that civilization, which he was pleased to define as the art of diffusing throughout a community the tranquil happiness which belongs to a virtuous and well-ordered household. Naturally desiring to represent in the most favorable colors the world from which I came, I touched but slightly, though indulgently, on the antiquated and decaying institutions of Europe, in order to expatiate on the present grandeur and prospective preeminence of that glorious American Republic, in which Europe enviously seeks its model and tremblingly foresees its doom. Selecting for an example of the social life of the United States, that city in which progress advances at the fastest rate, I indulged in an animated description of the moral habits of New York, mortified to see, by the faces of my listeners, that I did not make the favorable impression I had anticipated. I elevated my theme, dwelling on the excellence of democratic institutions, their promotion of tranquil happiness by the government of party, and the mode in which they diffuse such happiness throughout the community by preferring, for the exercise of power and the acquisition of honors, the lowliest citizens in point of property, education, and character. Fortunately, recollecting the peroration of his speech on the purifying influences of American democracy and their destined spread over the world, made by a certain eloquent senator for whose vote in the Senate a railway company to which my two brothers belonged had just paid $20,000, I wound up by repeating its glowing predictions of the magnificent future that smiled upon mankind, when the flag of freedom should float over an entire continent and 200 millions of intelligent citizens, accustomed from infancy to the daily use of revolvers, should apply to a cowering universe the doctrine of the Patriot Monroe. When I had concluded, my host gently shook his head and fell into a musing study, making a sign to me and his daughter to remain silent while he reflected. After a time, he said, in a very earnest and solemn tone, "If you think, as you say, that you, though a stranger, have received kindness at the hands of me and mine, I adjure you to reveal nothing to any other of our people respecting the world from which you came, unless, on consideration, I give you permission to do so. Do you consent to this request?" "Of course, I pledge my word to it," said I, somewhat amazed, and I extended my right hand to grasp his. But he placed my hand gently on his forehead and his own right hand on my breast, which is the custom amongst this race in all matters of promise or verbal obligations. Then, turning to his daughter, he said, "And you, Z, will not repeat to anyone what the stranger has said, or may say to me or to you, of a world other than our own." Z rose and kissed her father on the temples, saying with a smile, "Ajay's tongue is wanton, but love can fetter it fast. And if, my father, you fear lest a chance word from me or yourself could expose our community to danger by a desire to explore a world beyond us, will not a wave of the vril, properly impelled, wash even the memory of what we have heard the stranger say out of the tablets of the brain?" "What is vril?" I asked. Therewith Z began to enter into an explanation of which I understood very little, for there is no word in any language I know which is an exact synonym for vril. I should call it electricity, except that it comprehends in its manifold branches other forces of nature, to which, in our scientific nomenclature, differing names are assigned, such as magnetism, galvanism, etc. These people consider that in Vril they have arrived at the unity in natural energetic agencies, which has been conjectured by many philosophers above ground, and which Faraday thus intimates under the more cautious term of correlation. I have long held an opinion, says that illustrious experimentalist, almost amounting to a conviction in common, I believe, with many other lovers of natural knowledge, that the various forms under which the forces of matter are made manifest have one common origin, or in other words, are so directly related and mutually dependent that they are convertible, as it were, into one another, and possess equivalence of power in their action. These subterranean philosophers assert that by one operation of Vril, which Faraday would perhaps call atmospheric magnetism, they can influence the variations of temperature, in plain words, the weather; that by other operations, akin to those ascribed to mesmerism, electrobiology, otic force, etc., but applied scientifically through Vril conductors, they can exercise influence over minds and bodies, animal and vegetable, to an extent not surpassed in the romances of our mystics. To all such agencies they give the common name of Vril. Z asked me if in my world it was not known that all the faculties of the mind could be quickened to a degree unknown in the waking state, by trance or vision, in which the thoughts of one brain could be transmitted to another, and knowledge be thus rapidly interchanged. I replied that there were amongst us stories told of such trance or vision, and that I had heard much and seen something of the mode in which they were artificially effected, as in mesmeric clairvoyance, but that these practices had fallen much into disuse or contempt, partly because of the gross impostures to which they had been made subservient, and partly because, even where the effects upon certain abnormal constitutions were genuinely produced, the effects, when fairly examined and analyzed, were very unsatisfactory, not to be relied upon for any systematic truthfulness or any practical purpose, and rendered very mischievous to credulous persons by the superstitions they tended to produce. Z received my answers with much benignant attention, and said that similar instances of abuse and credulity had been familiar to their own scientific experience in the infancy of their knowledge, and while the properties of Vril were misapprehended. However, she reserved further discussion on this subject till I was more fitted to enter into it. She contented herself with adding that it was through the agency of Vril, while I had been placed in the state of trance, that I had been made acquainted with the rudiments of their language, and that she and her father, who alone of the family took the pains to watch the experiment, had acquired a greater proportionate knowledge of my language than I of their own, partly because my language was much simpler than theirs, comprising far less of complex ideas, and partly because their organization was, by hereditary culture, much more ductile and more readily capable of acquiring knowledge than mine. At this, I secretly demurred, and having had in the course of a practical life to sharpen my wits, whether at home or in travel, I could not allow that my cerebral organization could possibly be duller than that of people who had lived all their lives by lamplight. However, while I was thus thinking, Z quietly pointed her forefinger at my forehead and sent me to sleep. Stay tuned for part 2 of the coming race. Thank you for your support. Peace, blessings, and much love to you all.